Welcome everyone to the Fairbank Center's Policymakers Series. I have the pleasure of welcoming our 2024 Charles Neuhauser Memorial Lecturer, Ambassador Robert E. Lighthizer. Ambassador Lighthizer, welcome to campus. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I think it goes without saying, most of our audience knows who you are, but for those who don't, Ambassador Lighthizer served as the U.S. Trade Representative during the presidency of Donald Trump and was responsible for a course correction on U.S. trade policy towards China, including the conclusion of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China. So, Ambassador, welcome to Harvard. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly at the Fairbank Center. I, as you know, view China as a very important issue, and I think studying China is something that can't be overdone. Studying its history, its art, its literature, its politics is really, really an important part of educating America. So I applaud you for all the work you do.
No, and thank you for being here and speaking with our community and drawing the worlds of academia and policymaking together. I wanted to start by just asking a question of your worldview. I think for many years you took a view that was different than many who were engaged in both the trade economic space as well as with China. And that was a view that China, at least under Communist Party rule, served as a strategic threat to the United States, while others were saying closer economic integration would bring about political change, and even if not political change, at least a more liberal China that was a more responsible stakeholder and so forth. You've always been skeptical of that. So can you lay out what informs that worldview of yours?
So, first of all, let me say I'm not, personally hostile to China. I have an enormous admiration for China. I've read a lot of its history, and it's hard to read that history and not come away. You see the ups and the downs, but the highs are higher than anyone ever had, and the lows are about as low as it gets. So I admire China, first of all. Secondly, I don't think it's the role of the United States to in any way think about regime change or hostility to the Communist Party itself or the like. For me, it's a question of what's good for America. So I look at the relationship and I think of the kind of the basic touchstones. I think China believes that it should be number one in the world, and that it's inevitable that it will be number one in the world, and that we're in the way. So what do? They increase the size of their military. They have the largest Navy, the largest Army, et cetera. They focus their military very much on the United States. They grow their economy as fast as they can, which is fine, but they do it, in my judgment, very often in a predatory way. It's kind of like mercantilism combined with espionage, right? So and I think the net of that has been a giant transfer of wealth from the United States to China. And then you look, geopolitically, China is aggressive. They have militarized the South China Sea. They have territorial claims around most of their neighbors. I think they use their economic power to buoy up Russia, to support Iran. So they do a lot of things that are negative, and then they spy on the United States. So, and then the final thing is that if you look at the actual words, their words are more bellicose than they have been in recent years. So the notion for sure was in the 90s, China will become Switzerland if we just trade enough with them. And I think that I said that was foolishness then, and for sure it's been proven. I don't think anybody really has that view anymore.
So let me follow up on that. I think there are some who argue, right, you can segment the relationship. You can cooperate with China on issues like climate, pandemic, and they would put trade economics in that category. And then you can compete with them on the military geopolitical front. You've put forward this idea of the fact that the economic, and particularly our manufacturing capabilities, cannot be separated from our defense and our strategic posture. Can you elaborate on that a bit for our audience?
Sure. Well, first of all, China links them all together, right? Let's be honest about that. There's no way you can separate these things. Now, do I say don't cooperate on the climate? No, we ought to do those things. But the reality is national security and economic security are exactly the same. particularly in a context where you're dealing with wealth transfer. That is to say, we transfer enough wealth to China to pay for its military that they're building up, and also technology transfer. So to me, and the technology is often dual use. So we are trying to establish and promote the national security of the United States, while at the same time transferring wealth and technology to an adversary who is more and more openly hostile to the United States. So those ideas are very linked. Now, I'm not saying you don't talk to them about anything. I'm not even saying you don't talk to them about those things. But you try to design your policy so that it net helps the United States and not China. And I would say that is precisely what China is doing from the other side. They're trying to design their technology to be independent of the United States, independent of the West. They're trying to grow their economy as fast as they can to overcome the United States. They're trying to do the same thing in the security sphere. So what I'm saying is we can't sit here and meekly transfer all these things to them and realize that they have a different objective. We should behaving similarly to them in that respect, in the respect that we should design the relationship so that it net helps us and our people, our workers.
So this view that you articulated, and I think we both know from spending time in Washington, has taken hold within the Beltway. But here within academia, there are those who still think, well, at least on the economics, we can grow the pie for both of us. We can get towards some type of win-win solution. Well, theoretically, that might be true. I wanted to ask, based on your experience, why, at least under the current regime, do you think it's possible to design some ways to sort of think about growing the pie for everyone and just how we divide out that pie? Or do you really think that on these core issues, technology, strategic competition, IP, so forth, it really is more of a zero-sum competition right now?
Well, I would say, first of all, I'm not for no economic relationship with China. That's why I call it strategic decoupling. Something that Kevin Rudd said that's so clever is he said what China is doing to us is strategic decoupling with Chinese characteristics. So I'm really advocating a policy that is quite consistent with theirs towards us. So I think we ought to have trade, but it ought to be balanced trade. It shouldn't be a situation where we sell 150 billion and buy 500 billion. It shouldn't go on like that for a long period of time. In the area of technology, we shouldn't be transferring our technology to them, and we shouldn't be allowing it to be stolen or transferred through forced technology agreements. So I think we have to develop technology, our future technology, independently and with our allies. And I think we ought to have a relationship, economic relationship with China that does help both parties. Now we have one that overwhelmingly helps them and not us. Now, does it help some Americans? Of course, there are Americans who get very rich on a situation where the rest of the country gets poor, but that's not significant. Those people are not important really to the calculation. So these academics you reference who talk about a win-win, right now we don't have a win-win. We have a win for China and a loss for American workers and for the American economy. Now, it might be a win for a handful of academics or bankers or tech guys, but the reality is it's not a win-win now. If you have balanced trade, if you grow your technology independently, if you don't have U.S. investment going into helping their military and security stuff, if you don't have their investment in our military security where you lose your secrets, that's what I think of as strategic decoupling. And I think that's in the interest of the United States. And it's not against China. It's just net going to help us and not China. And that should be our objective.
So there's some in our audience who are Chinese and would be listening to us and thinking, well, I want to try to help design something that sort of helps the two sides get along a little bit better. What should they be pressuring their government to do, if they can do anything at all? Well,
I mean, my first advice to them would be to be secure and take care of yourself, because these are dangerous times. So clearly in areas of the arts and the like, there are a lot of things that we can do, and that's why I really started my remarks by saying how much I admire the Chinese culture, the Chinese history, the Chinese literature. I mean, there are great things about China, and the United States should know about them, and I think that softens people's view. But I wouldn't recommend to Chinese citizens watching this to try to influence their government in any way along the lines of what I suggest. Let their government make their own decisions and not.
All right, so I want to get to this concept of strategic decoupling and unpack a little bit more. So you spoke about this in your lecture today, and you specifically delineated its difference from this concept of de-risking. In a lot of people's minds, these are sort of two ways of talking about the same thing. Walk our audience through what's the difference between a de-risking or sort of a China plus one strategy as opposed to a strategic decoupling. And I just want to underscore what you said, right? You're not talking about full decoupling. You're just talking about decoupling in strategic industries that have spillover effects on American workers and America's national security.
So I think, as I said, I think there are three schools of thought in Washington on these issues, and in policy circles generally. There's the people who say do nothing, everything's fine. I would say whistle through the graveyard. And they're generally people who make a lot of money in China and importing and the like, and some public officials, many of whom hope to work for those companies. So that's the one group. That's not a very favored group, but there's a lot of big business groups in America that supply money to that view. And they either don't understand the nature of the threat or their own personal interests overcome their fear. The second group are sort of the de-riskers. The problem with de-risking is, the notion is this. The notion is we don't want to be reliant on an adversary. And we realize that's a problem. We saw a little taste of this in COVID, but it's a bigger problem than that. If you can't build an army tank without reliance on your foe, that's a problem. So what do these people do? They say, well, let's have a plan B. This is what de-risking means. We'll have a plan B. We'll get what we need over there in case of hostility, right? A real military war or just some other kind of diplomatic hostility. So we'll move over there. It strikes me as fanciful because the reality is you're not going to keep up with technology in your secondary supplier, number one. Number two, if you have a problem, that secondary supplier has to scale up. You're still going to have this problem. So to me, it's not well thought out. It can't really work. The other side of what these people think, and this is kind of a sub-paragraph under it, is small yard, high fence. This is the other side of it. This also is fanciful, in my opinion. You don't know how big the yard is because you don't know where cutting edge technology is going to go. That's the nature of cutting edge technology. So you just don't know. And in terms of the fence being impregnable, what technology is impregnable, right? I mean, you can make it better with investment restrictions and export restrictions, but the reality is you're relying on some kind of technology, and if we've learned anything in recent years is you can be hacked across the board. So this notion of de-risking strikes me as the kind of thing that you get into a room with, and the committee comes up with this. The one guy says, well, I like China. The other guy says, I don't like China. The one guy says, I like technology. And you say, what are we going to do? Well, let's just call it de-risking. And so the de-riskers kind of understand the threat, but not completely, in my opinion, kind of have a solution, but it's kind of a loosey-goosey sort of thing that kind of sounds intelligent until you sit back and say, well, hold on, how is this going to work in this real case? And then they don't really have an answer. And the strategic decouplers are not saying no economic relationship. What they are saying is, let's have a balanced economic relationship. Let's grow our new technology independently. Let's guard our technology, which is, by the way, exactly the same thing that China's not growing their new technology with us. It's absurd to think that they are. Grow it with ourselves and our allies. Let's have investment going in each direction, be net in the interest of the United States, just like China. You think anybody invests $1 billion from China in the United States that the Communist Party doesn't say that's in the interest of China? No, not a chance in the world of that. And the same going the other way. So I'm just saying, let's have a sensible relationship that's balanced. No wealth transfer, no technology transfer, economic transfer, of course, cultural and other interchanges and the like, and of course, discussions with people. And I'm not saying let's just set up a wall and be in isolation. That's not the objective at all. The objective is right now we're on a trajectory where we are putting ourselves at risk to a country at least a party that is more and more openly hostile to the United States. We have to reverse that trajectory, and strategic decoupling is the way to begin that process. And we kind of began this in the Trump administration, and to their credit, part of it at least, the Biden administration has maintained the tariffs and the like. So they're trying to wrestle what they have, what their policy should be. But this de-risking, small yard, high fence stuff strikes me as not really very realistic.
And to be clear, the Chinese strategy, in your view, is mirrored, right?
I would like to have a discussion with someone who thinks the contrary. I don't know a sensible person who one doesn't agree with me on the nature of the threat, at least right now. Now, some will say the threat didn't exist before the current president, right? You hear that all the time. But everyone who thinks about these and is sensible says, yes, we are at a point where there's a genuine risk here, and the relationship is very lopsided. And that is significant. So for sure, that's where I come out.
So let me turn this a little bit towards our allies, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Right? I think it's clear also in today's world, especially with regards to technologies, we can't do it alone. We've got to be doing this in conjunction with our allies. Not all of our allies necessarily are on this page. In fact, the de-risking term has become quite popular amongst some of our allies. Obviously, geography matters quite a bit, right? If you're sitting a few 100 miles away, if that's your largest trading market, that's a different type of economic relationship, and so on and so forth. But is there something that you think is missing in terms of the way they're thinking about how they balance trade and economic relationship with China compared to the United States? Is there something more we ought to be doing to sort of convince them of this type of worldview? I just wanted to invite you to chat a bit more about
Well,
that.
the sort of them is the question, right? I mean, no one knows more about this than the Japanese. Mm-hmm. They're there, they're trying to wrestle with it, but they understand, and they were, I thought, our clearest ally on how to approach this thing. De-risking will be something that a lot of them will go to for the same reason the administration did. It's amorphous. It doesn't really have much meaning. There's no hard lines. You're not really doing anything. So that's where a committee comes out. That's we used to refer to the non-decision principle. De-risking is another word for the non-decision principle. So you take Japan. They understand. They seem to get it. And then you move around the region. What you see in a lot of places are people that have surpluses in trade with us and deficits with China. Right, and that's a situation which, to me, at least, makes no sense at all. Right, I mean, so and the notion that they're going to be friendlier to one versus the other because of that strikes me as wrong. The people that are there, if I were there and advising them, I would say one, it's the geopolitical situation that you're in. That's the number one thing. Second is trade. You want to do everything you can, obviously, to help yourself economically, but they're at far more risk than we are just because of geography.
And some here would say, well, that difference is a reflection of savings rates. But I think you would say there's...
I'm not a buyer of... So the notion, just for your viewers, is the United States consumes too much, and these countries have a savings rate. And I understand that's what economists believe, and that's all fine. In my judgment, at least, if we did something else to get the trade deficit down, our savings rate would go up. In other words, it's not like Americans are somehow different and the people in Thailand save and we spend. No, we have products that we have an economic system that is designed to have products come to us much cheaper. And so we have a trade deficit. And that trade deficit is what makes the savings rate low. And they have, in many cases, not in all, in many cases, a mercantilist economic policy that creates surpluses, which they're, in my judgment, smart to do if they can get away with it. And those surpluses, just because of the way the equation works out, means they're saving more. So I'm not buying the idea that one versus the other thinks or the like differently, or that if you took a person from Thailand or Vietnam and put them in the United States with our situation and our prices, they would buy products that they could afford. So look, the problem to me is the the trade deficit, the way the trade rules are set up, and if that became balanced, then we wouldn't have a difference in savings rate.
The other thing I hear sometimes people say is, look, it's too late. We've lost our comparative advantage, or even if you push it away from China, it's not coming back here. I know you're very much a skeptic of that belief. I think you and I both believe that that's perhaps dangerous almost to embrace that type of
in
mindset.
the first place,
but I just wanted to have you.
It's completely defeatist, first of all. So I have these people, and I said, so what should we do? Just tell our grandchildren, don't worry, you're going to live in poverty in a bad country. I mean, that's not really what they're suggesting, that it's inevitable. So I find all that talk defeatist and sort of foolish. This notion that we have lost our competitive advantage is another thing that doesn't make any sense to me. Competitive advantage, people think of it like, well, we have a lot of coal, and therefore I have a competitive advantage in coal. No, most competitive advantages are created by industrial policy, by the government. They're not, something that just happened because of the nature of your soil or of your people or the like. They're created by industrial policy. Look at Korea has a great competitive steel industry. There's no competitive advantage that Korea has in steel. Why are chips made in Taiwan? Do you think that they mine chips in Taiwan? They just happen to have a bunch of chip mines there? No, these are created by government. And our government can do the same thing, either through proper tax, proper regulatory policy, other subsidies where necessary, a sensible trade policy. You can do all these things. You create a competitive advantage. Look, the United States had a trade surplus from I don't know, the maybe 1870s until well after the First World War, right? And then it kind of bounced around. It's only become a chronic problem since the year 2000 when China joined the WTO, right? That's the only time it's become. It kind of went like this, and then like this, and then. In 2001 or 2000, the United States all became lazy, lost all their competitive advantage, and lost their savings rate. I mean, come on, it's just not realistic. It's people looking at a bad situation which is created through external forces, and rather than change that relationship, what they want to do is rationalize why the worker who lost his job is really the problem. And my approach is, no, the problem is government policy. That worker lost his job because of government policy. He didn't lose it because he was lazy or had too many televisions or anything. He lost because of government policy. And look, I don't think there's a country in the world that would maintain the same government and have trade deficits like this. Just think about it in history, right? I mean, we get away with it because we're the reserve currency, but the reality is no country in the world would subject themselves to trillions and trillions of dollars for decades of trade deficit.
So what more do you think we should be doing here at home to sort of strengthen ourselves for this competition?
Well, so for me, and I don't want to spend the whole time on it, but to me it's one, you want to have, in my judgment, lower business taxes. Personal taxes make your decision. You need lower business. You have to be able to compete. We have, and this is like off the train of what you and I have been talking about, but we have several $100 billion worth of profit from U.S. companies taken in Ireland. Well, there's only 5 million people in Ireland, right? So what is that? That's tax policy. Their taxes are lower, and people, and it's a question of intellectual property laws and the like. So we have to do a bunch of things like that to get ourselves in shape. We have to have proper regulatory policy. Right now, we're making things more expensive. We're making it hard to do things, putting a burden on our companies, encouraging them to move overseas because of regulatory policy. We have to correct that. And then I think we need. I'm suspicious of subsidies generally, but you clearly need them in certain areas. You need them in chips. You need them in robotics. You need them in the kinds of advanced materials. You need to incentivize those things so that you have the technology for the future. And then you need a sensible trade policy. And to me, that is you're going to need, in some cases, tariffs, and then export controls to make sure that you maintain a fair environment that encourages American companies to manufacture here, to employ Americans, but also to keep their their profits and their technology in America and with our allies.
So to close, I just want to ask one final question. You're here today to deliver the Neuhauser lecture, and Charlie Neuhauser was an alum who grew up during the course of the Cold War, really married the world of government policy making ideas with academia and making sure that that made a difference in terms of shaping U.S. policy towards China. For our students here today who are interested in pursuing this type of career, what kind of advice do you have for them?
Well, I would say, first of all, if I had to give them one piece of advice, I would say be a contrarian. Don't go along with what everybody thinks all the time. You have to sit back and think for yourself. And my hope is that those that are Americans think about it very much from an American point of view, those that are European from a European point of view, and those that are China from a Chinese point of view. I mean, the reality is you've got to take care of your own country, and everyone doing that will create a competition that's, I think, beneficial to people across the world.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you to all of you for joining us today for another Fairbank Center Policymakers Series.